This video is on the nervous system and covers aspects of evolution of organisms, in particular about how they coordinate and control action through the nervous system. It's mostly covered in chapter 17, but with a little bit of chapter 18. So key concepts from the subject outline are really around how homeostasis depends on that functioning of both the nervous and the endocrine systems, and in particular how the nervous system is organized, how neurons work, and how they communicate with each other. So cell communication really begins with the concept that all cells secrete molecules, usually just for their regular function. And early on in evolution, cells detecting the products of other cells who are able to use this as information to understand what sort of density those cells are in. So bacteria these days, increasingly we've found that they're able to detect and kind of count how many of their other cells are around in the colony, and then respond accordingly depending on the density that they're in. In eukaryotic cells, we definitely experience the understanding of how there's special secretory organelles, vesicles, that can be used with exocytosis to send out deliberate signals that can be picked up by other cells in a cell-to-cell communication sort of way. And this works, I guess, at that single-celled organism level, but we have to start to understand how, as a multicellular organism, cell-to-cell communication can be established when the cell that's signaling might be a very long way from the cell that it's signaling to, the target cell. So when cells secrete molecules, they will diffuse into the extracellular fluid, but this diffusion is quite limited in its range, and so it's unlikely that two cells in different parts of a multicellular organism will be able to communicate with each other. So how have adaptations through evolution developed to allow this to happen in multicellular organisms? So one is for the cell that's signaling to grow a very long process, so that when it releases those secreted chemical signals, there's actually not that much of a gap between the cells. Even if the cell bodies are far apart, this cell is still very close to this cell. And in fact, that kind of adaptation is what we see in the nervous system. Another option is, as multicellular organisms evolve, there was the requirement for a transport or circulatory system to allow food, nutrients, oxygen to travel around the body, and signaling cells can release their signals and use the transport system to diffuse those signals much further than they would otherwise do. And this is the kind of strategy that's used in the endocrine system. So here are the two systems. So the nerve cell is a specialized type of secretory cell that grows this long process or axon. That means it can make close contact with a cell that's in other ways quite far away from it and release signaling chemicals, which in this case are called neurotransmitter. For the endocrine system, specialized secretory cells in glands called endocrine cells will release chemical signals that go into the bloodstream, travel through that in order to contact target cells at some distance away. The endocrine system is covered in chapter 18, and in another video we'll focus on the nervous system. So the nervous system as a whole is comprised of the brain, spinal cord, peripheral nerves, and other nerve structures throughout the body. The brain and spinal cord together make up the central nervous system, where most of the processing of information happens, and the peripheral nervous system is mostly these nerves that come from and to the central nervous system. So that when we actually look at a nerve, such as the nerve running down your arm, it's actually obviously going to connect to the spinal cord either through this dorsal or ventral route, and it's a bundle of lots of different axons together. So axon is that thin process coming out of the nerve cell. Those are wrapped in supportive cells, in this case it's called a Schwann cell, and then bundled up to make a nerve. So a nerve is a bundle of axons. So neurons themselves have very complicated structures, and so you can see here the cell body and all of these processes that are coming out of it. Some are labeled D for dendrite, some AX for axon. We tend to draw a more simplified version of this to help us understand it. So the cell body will have dendrites connected. These tend to receive information. and then an axon which sends out information. And again, there might be cells like the Schwann cells, or another type of cell is an oligodendrocyte that surround that axon before it connects to another cell, which is called the postsynaptic cell. The synapse here being the gap between the axon and the next cell, and this one's after that gap, so it's the postsynaptic cell. And obviously, the role of neurons is to send signals, and so the signal direction is along the axon towards the synapse. And the synaptic terminal is that specialized structure for releasing the secreted chemicals, the neurotransmitters. So nerve cells will connect up to each other in what we call pathways. So here's a simple pathway, a stimulus and receptor. Remember when we first started talking about homeostasis, it's around stimulus and response. So stimulus goes through receptor, and in the internal workings here we have a sensory neuron, which will connect to an interneuron or multiple interneurons for processing the information, and then out to a motor neuron, which will then innervate or connect to an effector such as a muscle tissue, which will then cause the response. So interneurons are in here doing all of that processing, neurons that connect to other neurons, with sensory and motor neurons receiving and putting out information. What you'll also see sometimes is because the interneuron processing can take a long time, we have a reflex arc. So reflex actions bypass that and go straight from picking up the information, processing that very rapidly to create a response. And this is required in many reflex actions where a quick action is required because the stimulus is harmful. So we see this in the eye, not when it's looking at water, but obviously if there's a bright light, then the pupil will contract through the iris muscle, and that's a reflex arc. And we know about this with withdrawing your arm from burning heat as well. Things like that are reflexes. And that's because this pathway is much shorter and the response is much faster. So just taking a look a little bit more closely at the three types of neuron there. So here's the motor neuron. Again, dendrites, cell body, axon terminals. The interneurons have a similar sort of structure to that. Sensory neurons, again, similar structure. The main thing here is that the cell body tends to be in a different position because they're receiving information and also sending out information on either side of that cell body. But again, these are fairly simplified. We can have thousands of dendrites collecting information and thousands of axon terminals. So one neuron doesn't just communicate with one other cell, it receives information from many cells and sends out information to many cells. In the case of interneurons, this is neuron to neuron. In the case of a motor neuron, it's receiving information from other neurons, but these axon terminals are actually connecting to muscle. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at that axon terminal then. So here's some axon terminals, and the red we see along here is an electrical signal, an action potential that travels along that. When it reaches the terminal, it stimulates the chemical signal, the neurotransmitter to be released, and this blue neuron is connecting to multiple other neurons that are signaled to it. If it gets enough chemical signal there, it will create its own action potential and send that along the axon. Looking more closely then at the nerve terminal then, the synapse, what we see here is that when that nerve terminal receives the action potential, which is number 1 here, that these vesicles that are full of neurotransmitter will fuse with the plasma membrane and release that neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, or the gap that's between those two cells. That neurotransmitter will bind to a receptor through complementary protein-protein binding, or protein neurotransmitter binding. And because these receptors are actually ion channels, they will open and then ions will flow in. Now we know the movement of ions causes a change in the charge of the postsynaptic cell, and this is how the electrical signal, the action potential, first starts. So neurons rely on electrical transmission of information and chemical, so we call it electrochemical transmission from one cell to the next.